Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow candlelit walk back into the Middle Ages and era of long winters. Longer sermons, and surprisingly complicated ideas about love and lust. You'll step over muddy thresholds into straw-stuffed beds, hear whispered promises beneath timber beams, and maybe squirm a little at what passed for romance in the age of leeches and Latin prayers. And fair warning, you probably wouldn't survive a week in this world. Between the lice, the church guilt, and the complete lack of deodorant. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. Let's see how far this sleepy history lesson travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a village that smells faintly of smoke, sweat, and something that's probably turnips. It's the 12th century. You're wearing rough-spun wool, your feet are sore, and the local priest has been glaring at you ever since that incident with the miller's daughter, or son. It's hard to say. History, like memory, can be fuzzy in the dark. In this world, sex isn't just a private matter, it's a moral issue, a political strategy, and sometimes an actual courtroom drama. And while modern people worry about texting back too fast, your medieval self is more concerned with whether lust is a sin, whether your marriage is even legal, and whether that herbal remedy from the village healer will work or make your ears fall off. First things first, people did have sex in the Middle Ages. Quite a lot, actually. It's one of those topics medieval chroniclers liked to pretend didn't exist unless they were condemning it, or obsessively cataloging scenes for confession manuals. But in between all the religious rhetoric and political power games, real humans still fell in love, fumbled in the dark, and got very creative about sneaking around rules. You'd think the church's grip meant no one got any action. But humans are resourceful, and the church, well, let's just say it had a lot of rules, and not a lot of consistency. One priest might tell you marital sex is okay, as long as you're making babies. Another might insist you avoid it during Lent, Advent, Sundays, feast days, fast days, Wednesdays, Fridays. So basically, never. And people did try to follow the rules, at least when someone was watching. But not everyone lived in fear of the sermon. Some villages treated the church's sexual restrictions the way modern folks treat speed limits, technically there, but very negotiable depending on who's around. Now about those chastity belts. You've probably seen the metal monstrosities in memes or museum displays. Turns out, they're mostly myth-satirical jokes, or later forgeries, not common medieval practice. Actual medieval couples were far more subtle. Women might wear long laced garments, impossible to remove without help. Men might swear oaths to saints before going off to war, trusting often naively that their partners would wait faithfully. Spoiler, many didn't. And sex wasn't just about passion, it was a business arrangement, a religious duty, a family obligation. Nobles married for land and alliances. Peasants married for help on the farm. Romance came later. Or not at all. Of course, medieval people didn't think of sex in the same tidy categories we use now. Love, desire, sin, and reproduction were all wrapped up in layers of symbolism and superstition. Men were thought to be hot and dry, women cold and wet, according to the science of the time, which we now file under deeply incorrect. That made women the more lustful of the two. Yes, really. Some texts warned that women were essentially bottomless wells of temptation, luring men to ruin with a glance. Others claimed men were the ones constantly teetering on the edge of uncontrollable arousal. Historians still argue whether this contradiction was deliberate confusion, or just medieval science doing its usual weird thing. And the smells, oh the smells. Bathing wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't frequent either, unless you were lucky enough to live near a bathhouse, which oddly enough, often doubled as a place for both scrubbing and not scrubbing. We'll get there later. For now, just imagine lying down on a straw mattress with someone who hasn't bathed in a week, and trying to feel romantic, while chickens peck around your feet. That was Tuesday. Privacy, not a thing. Most people shared a room with their entire family. You'd sleep head to foot, with your siblings, parents, maybe a goat. Curtains were rare, and doors were basically suggestions. Want to get frisky? Better wait for a foggy morning, a festival distraction, or a moonless night when no one's listening. Or if you're a noble, just send the servants away and pretend. You don't hear them gossiping outside the door. Even love songs were full of double meanings. Troubadours in the south of France crafted lyrical masterpieces about longing and temptation, many of which featured elaborate metaphors for what we'd call getting to know someone very well. A knight might pine for a lady he could never touch, or write suggestive poetry and slip it under her chamber door while her husband was out hawking. Still, despite all the barriers, social, spiritual, and literal, people found ways to connect, sometimes clumsily, sometimes tenderly, sometimes under a haystack. And if you think this sounds romantic in a scruffy, firelight sort of way, well, wait until we get to the virginity tests. You're sitting now in a rough wooden pew, your knees aching, as incense coils through the rafters of a cold stone church. A monk, with a face like week-old porridge, is droning about the 7 deadly sins. And lucky you list is right up there, just below pride and well above sloth. In this medieval world, the church doesn't just frown on desire. It files it under mortal peril. Sex, according to the church, is dangerous. It distracts from prayer, tempts the flesh, and, if done incorrectly, as there is a correct way, might doom your soul forever. The ideal Christian life, says your local bishop, is one of restraint, discipline, and as little moaning as possible, outside of childbirth. But here's the thing. While the clergy thundered on about carnal sins from the pulpit, regular people were very much still, human. And behind closed doors, or open barn doors, let's be honest, they made their own peace with the rules. The official stance was pretty rigid. Marital sex was technically allowed, but only under strict conditions. Missionary position, no pleasure seeking. Only if you were married, of course. And ideally, only if you intended to make a baby. It wasn't about love. It was about duty. So much so that confessors had checklists. Literally, there were confession manuals, detailing which positions counted as sinful, anything not missionary, which days were off limits, Lent, Advent, over 100 holy days per year, and what to do if you accidentally enjoyed it. Still, you can't legislate libido, and medieval couples found loopholes faster than you can say "Forgive me, Father." Some ignored the rules altogether. Others made clever use of church ambiguities. Take marriage, for instance. You didn't always need a priest or ceremony, just mutual consent and intent to be exclusive. So if 2 teens whispered vows under an oak tree, and then sealed the deal in the hayloft, the church might eventually have to accept it as valid, even if their parents were very unhappy. And yes, monks and priests were supposed to be celibate, but that didn't stop many from taking housekeepers with suspiciously well-fed children. In England, by the 13th century, church courts were so overwhelmed with complaints about clergy concubines that bishops had to fine them into submission. Or, more accurately, fine them into just paying to keep doing it. Historians still argue whether this widespread bending of the rules was willful disobedience or just a kind of cultural shrug, like knowing you're not supposed to double park, but doing it anyway if the priest does it too. And the contradictions ran deep. On one hand, the church denounced lust as a devilish distraction. On the other, it used sexually charged imagery in its own writings. Some mystics, like St. Catherine of Siena, wrote ecstatic visions filled with deeply sensual language kisses from Christ, burning hearts, longing that bordered on the erotic. These weren't considered scandalous. They were published, repeatedly. You can almost hear the cognitive dissonance clunking through the cathedral like a dropped hymnal. Meanwhile, theologians debated whether Mary had experienced pain during childbirth, or whether Adam and Eve had sex in the Garden of Eden. Spoiler, they mostly agreed they didn't, because paradise was too pure for sweaty fumbling. That came later, after the apple, after shame entered the picture. Which means, congratulations, you, dear listener, are descended from the world's first guilty hookup, back in your sleepy little village. The local priest might give you a side eye if your wife is visibly pregnant during Lent, but unless you were being particularly scandalous, he'd probably let it slide. Public penance was usually reserved for repeat offenders, loudmouths, or people caught in the act, preferably in the churchyard. Yes, it happened. Frequently, there's a recorded case from 1379, where 2 peasants were fined for open lewdness. On consecrated ground, the fine 1 sheep and 2 barrels of ale. Medieval justice was weirdly negotiable, but things got harsher when politics got involved. Kings and queens were expected to embody virtue, which made their sex lives public property. Royal couples had to produce heirs, obviously, but how and when they did so was monitored closely. Papal dispensations were needed if they were too closely related, which, honestly, was a constant issue. The ruling families of Europe were basically one big awkward family reunion. Occasionally with swords, sexual scandal at the royal level could topple dynasties. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. Married to 2 kings, mother to 2 more, she was admired, feared, and whispered about. Rumors swirled about her court being full of passion and poetry, some claimed. She held sensual tournaments where women judged knights based on their lovemaking. Probably false. Probably. But the fact people believed it tells you plenty about it. Medieval anxieties. And then there were the heretics. Breakaway religious groups often had interesting ideas about sex. Some sects, like the Cathars, believed physical reproduction was inherently evil and abstained completely. Others leaned into free love, claiming all things, including partner, should be shared. These fringe groups were swiftly condemned, not just for theological error, but because their teachings threatened the whole control structure of society. If you tell peasants they can have sex without guilt, marry without priests, and love without shame, well, that's practically revolutionary. Of course, not everyone was in revolt. Many devout couples did follow the rules, or tried to. Some even prayed before sex. Not for success, mind you, but for forgiveness, just in case that sigh had been too sincere. So tonight, as you snuggle deeper into your sheets, think of a time when desire came with footnotes, when pleasure needed permission, and when love had to tiptoe around 100 holy days. A world where sin and skin were always tangled on. Nobody was quite sure who was getting away with what. You wake before dawn on a bed that isn't so much a bed as it is a wooden platform covered with something that was once straw but now mostly crumbles and squeaks. A drafty window lets in the morning mist. You stretch and bump elbows with your brother, or your mother, or your neighbor's kid. You're not exactly sure whose leg is whose anymore. Welcome to Peasant Love, Medieval Edition. It's romantic in the same way that a turnip stew is gourmet. It gets the job done. But you probably wouldn't post about it, here in the world of the working class over 90% of the population. You live in a 1-room house. Maybe 2 if you're lucky, or your uncle is the village miller. You share everything's space, chores, gossip, and air. Privacy is a luxury you don't even realize you're missing, because you've never known it. And yet, people still fall in love. They still flirt while fetching water, sneak glances at May Day dances, and whisper sweet nothings while shucking beans. Romance blooms where it can, between livestock pens and communal bread ovens. Marriage isn't exactly a fairy tale. Most unions are practical, to families joining labor forces, land, or livestock. Love may or may not come later. If it doesn't, well, you learn to get along, or just stop talking. Historians still argue whether peasant marriages were generally content, or just cooperative acts of economic survival. But records show couples often stuck together, raised children, and even made joint decisions, especially when it came to land, goats, and who was hogging the blanket. As for courtship rituals, they're charmingly low budget. Boys might toss girls apples during village festivals, or leave carved wooden spoons outside a sweetheart's door. Girls might give ribbons or garlands in return. No one's writing sonnets, but someone's definitely blushing behind the laundry. And once the flirting's done, what then? Where does one get to know a person more intimately in a 1-room house? The answer, very quietly, and often very late. Couples took advantage of darkness, drunk uncles, and heavy rains. Some communities even practiced bundling, a tradition in which an unmarried couple shared a bed fully clothed or wrapped in a bundling bag, with the expectation of staying chaste. Predictably, This worked about as well as telling two teens today to just hold hands. There's even a phrase from a 14th century court case describing a child conceived in the sack of bundling. So yeah, everybody knew what was going on. Still, pregnancy before marriage wasn't the end of the world. In many rural areas, it was almost expected. A baby bump was solid evidence the groom could father children, kind of like a medieval paternity test. Sure, the church frowned on it, but practical villagers were more focused on survival than sermons. That said, some regions did crack down harder. In parts of Scandinavia and the Holy Roman Empire, village councils kept close tabs on moral conduct. If you were caught being familiar outside of wedlock, you could be fined, publicly shamed, or made to sit in the town square wearing a sign that read "Fornicmare." Yes, really. Imagine Tinder, but with actual consequences. And while you're imagining, picture this. It's harvest season. You've been working the fields all day. Your back aches. Your hands are blistered. And you've got about 10 minutes before you fall asleep standing up. Still, you catch someone's eye by the communal well. There's a spark, a shared loaf, a smile. Maybe you arrange to accidentally take the same footpath tomorrow. Even in the muddiest corners of life, romance finds a way. And it's not all hay and hormones. Peasant communities pass down traditional remedies and advice about love, fertility, and attraction. Folk magic played a huge role. One love charm involved placing your sweat-soaked shirt under your crush's pillow for 3 nights without them noticing. Another included whispering a rhyme while tying knots in a piece of hair. Historians still argue whether these customs were genuinely believed to work, or just offered people a sense of control in lives otherwise ruled by weather and feudal dues. Birth control. It existed, sort of. Most peasants couldn't afford elaborate potions or physicians, but they had knowledge. Some used herbal contraceptives, like pennyroyal or wild carrot. Others swore by strange practices, like jumping backward after sex, or tying certain stones around their waist. Again, results were mixed. But hey, effort counts. And if things went sideways, say a lover spurned, or a pregnancy denied, watch out. Medieval villages thrived on gossip. A wronged woman might curse her ex under her breath at market. A jilted boy might compose a crude rhyme and scratch it into a tree. Emotions ran deep. People remembered slights for generations. There's even a 14th century case of a woman who stole her former lover's boots in revenge. Emotional maturity was not a universal standard. Still, love endured, even without privacy, perfume, or poetry. You see it in the burial records of couples buried side by side, in joint wills, in tiny inscriptions carved into pews. One French example from 1322 reads, simply, G-time, Alice. I love you, Alice. No grand gestures, just a lifetime of shared chores, laughter, bread, and the occasional goat emergency. So the next time you sigh about your love life, remember, it could be worse. You could be trying to woo someone in a hut filled with 12 people, a squealing pig, and a bed that creaks louder than your conscience. The floor beneath your feet is stone now, not dirt. You've stepped into a grand hall, where torchlight dances off polished wood and gilded banners. Welcome to the world of nobles where the floors are cleaner, the fur is thicker, and sex is still awkward. But now with paperwork, in medieval noble society, intimacy wasn't just personal, it was political. Every touch, every marriage, every heir had consequences. Love, if it happened at all, came after land grants and dowries were sorted out. In this world, a bedroom is often less a sanctuary and more a negotiation chamber. You were probably married off in your teens. 14 was normal for girls, 16 for boys, sometimes younger, depending on whose lands needed combining. The contracts were signed by parents or guardians, and if you were royal, there might have been a literal audience when you were officially wed. And by officially, we mean when the marriage was consummated. Some noble marriages were validated only after witnesses confirmed the deed was done. Yes, sometimes they stood behind curtains. Sometimes they checked the sheets. And sometimes, hold your groan, they threw a party afterward. Romance, huh? But that doesn't mean nobles didn't try to spice things up. They just did it with florin, servants, lots of servants. A lady might receive a poem written in rosewater ink. A lord might court his wife with silk gowns and imported fruit. There are letters from 15th century noblemen practically begging for more alone time with their wives, filled with endearing lines like "I burn for your sweet presence, as my lands wither for want of rain." We'd roll our eyes, but hey, at least he tried. Now, let's talk bedrooms. A noble's bed was a towering fortress of velvet curtains, feather mattresses, and carved headboards. But don't be fooled, it wasn't just for sleeping, or even just for couples. Servants might sleep at the foot. Pets nestled nearby. Children, often close by in trundle beds. Even here, privacy wasn't absolute. But you could close the drapes and pretend. Still, noble intimacy wasn't just about personal pleasure, it was about production. Producing heirs. Producing alliances. Producing political peace. A king who failed to father a son could throw the whole kingdom into war. Just ask Henry VIII actually. Don't. We'll be here all night. This pressure to procreate led to some weird workarounds. For example, if a couple couldn't conceive, people didn't always blame the man. The woman was often seen as the vessel, and if the vessel wasn't filling up, clearly something was wrong with her. Physicians recommended a variety of charming treatments like drinking a fertility tonic made of mare's milk and powdered stag antler, or lying with one's legs elevated on bricks post-intercourse. And let's not forget the prayers. So many prayers. There were specific saints you could ask for help in the bedroom department. Saint Margaret, for childbirth. Saint Valentine, not just for love, but for overcoming coldness of flesh. One particularly desperate couple made a pilgrimage to a shrine after 15 childless years, returned home, and reportedly conceived within a week. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe medieval faith came with a fertility boost. Still, not every noble union was dry and dutiful. Some couples truly liked each other. Other letters between real medieval husbands and wives revealed tenderness, longing, and even humor. One German count wrote his wife from the battlefield, "You know, I would rather face 3 swords than 1 winter without you in our bed." Honestly, swoon. But not everyone stayed loyal. Affairs happened, quietly, dangerously, and often with poetic flair. A noblewoman might fall for a handsome squire. A bored lord might visit a favored maidservant. Discretion was key. Nobles, who got caught, risked more than dirty looks. They risked scandal, exile, or worse. One French duchess in the 14th century was accused of adultery and ended up imprisoned for over a decade. Her lover, beheaded, and you thought your ex was dramatic. But not all lovers were punished. Some affairs were tolerated, even expected, especially if the marriage was strictly political. As long as public order was maintained, and no illegitimate heirs messed up the inheritance charts, people often turned a blind eye. Historians still argue whether noble women had more sexual agency than their peasant counterparts. On one hand, they had money, education, and networks. On the other, they were under constant scrutiny. A noble lady might wield power through charm, reputation, or whispered influence, but she could lose everything with a single accusation. The stakes were always higher when your dowry came with a title. And those noble children, sometimes they were born of love. Sometimes they were the result of duty. Sometimes, we honestly don't know. DNA testing wasn't a thing, but gossip absolutely was. There are royal family trees that still raise eyebrows. Did Queen X really bear the king's son? Or was it the knight with the suspiciously shiny armor? We may never know. But the court poet's suggestive verses might give you a hint. So here you are, tucked into an embroidered bed, surrounded by candlelight and velvet shadows. You've fulfilled your duty for the crown, kissed the ring, and endured the ceremonial congratulations from your in-law. Maybe you even got a ruby necklace out of it. And as the fire dies down and your official bed partner begins to snore softly beside you, you can't help but wonder, does love always come after duty, or just sometimes? Either way, you've got a ball to attend tomorrow, and a son to conceive before spring. The room is silent, except for the crackle of a dying fire and the soft rustle of linen. A young bride sits stiffly on the edge of a bed, face pale, fingers nervously twisting her veil. Nearby, an older woman, perhaps an aunt or a housemaid with hawk-like precision, ready to assist if needed. No pressure. Just your entire family name, property rights, and local gossip riding on whether a bloodstain appears by morning. Welcome to the world of virginity tests, one of medieval Europe's favorite bad ideas, in an age obsessed with lineage and inheritance. Female purity wasn't just a virtue, it was a requirement. A woman's worth, especially among nobles and merchants, was often tied directly to her perceived virginity. The assumption being, if she bled on the wedding night, she was untouched, trustworthy, and officially valid. No blood? Well, cue the suspicion, blame, and awkward breakfast conversation. But biology, as modern science has kindly explained, doesn't always cooperate with such rigid expectations. Not all women bleed during first intercourse. Some never have a hymen. Some lose it riding horses, climbing trees, or just living life in corsets. Medieval folks, however, didn't have TikToks from Obgins to explain this. So instead, they made up tests. One popular method. The infamous premarital inspection. A midwife or designated matron would examine the bride for signs of virginity, based on everything from her physical appearance to the tightness of her skin. A pale face, small breasts, and bashfulness were considered telltale signs of chastity. Bold eyes and full lips. Suspicious, and yes, this was a real thing. Entire books were written, outlining these so-called virtues, with illustrations that basically amounted to medieval purity checklists. Historians still argue whether these tests were widely enforced or more symbolic. But the anxiety they caused was very real. Now, if a woman passed the test or at least produced blood-stained sheets after her wedding night, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Some families even displayed the sheets publicly, like a weird neighborhood trophy. Others just quietly folded them and stored them away, just in case anyone questioned the marriage later. Sentimental and terrifying. But what if there was no blood? Then things got complicated. Some brides, knowing the risks, took creative precautions. Stories tell of women pricking their own fingers to ensure a few drops of red. Others used dyes, animal blood, or even crushed berries soaked into cloth. One case, from a 14th century French town, tells of a bride who stuffed her sheets with sheep's liver. Yes, it worked. No, her husband never found out, lest he noticed a weird smell, and it wasn't just nobles obsessing over virginity. Merchant families did it too, especially those climbing the social ladder. A wealthy merchant might arrange a lucrative match for his daughter, and her purity became a kind of guarantee. The church, for its part, reinforced the whole concept, with constant reminders about Eve's fall and the defilement of women who strayed. But the consequences weren't evenly applied. A nobleman with a mistress was a rogue. A noblewoman with a lover was scandal incarnate. And a peasant girl, she might be fined, shunned, or worse, married off in a hurry to avoid shame. That's where handfasting comes in. In some rural areas, a couple could declare themselves married by holding hands and exchanging vows in front of witnesses. If the woman was already pregnant, this was especially common. It saved face and made the child legitimate, quick, efficient, and socially acceptable, provided the parents weren't too furious. And here's where things get even weirder. Some legal systems actually had virginity clauses built into marriage contracts. In a few parts of medieval Europe, if a bride was discovered not to be a virgin, the husband could annul the marriage and demand the dowry returned. In some cases, this led to lawsuits, where doctors, priests, and neighbors were called in to testify about a woman's prior state. Imagine your ex arguing in court over whether you looked too comfortable holding a chicken when you were 12. That's roughly the vibe. Naturally, not everyone accepted this system. Some women fought back, claiming false accusations, or arguing their case in front of sympathetic judges. There are even records of women winning these dispute victories, but notable. One 15th century case in Italy features a woman who proved her virginity by swearing an oath on the bones of a local saint, and her mother testifying she'd been locked in the house since puberty. Unsettling, but effective. And all of this. Attention to female purity didn't extend to men. Surprise. A groom's chastity was almost never questioned. If anything, A man with experience was admired, while a timid husband might be mocked. This imbalance meant enormous pressure was heaped onto young brides, while grooms mostly worried about how drunk their friends were getting downstairs. But let's not pretend this was all cold and clinical. Some couples did fall in love genuinely, awkwardly, and against the odds. Letters from the period reveal bashful husbands apologizing for being clumsy in bed, or wives teasing their partners for being too eager. The tenderness is there, if you squint past the legal clauses, and over time, attitudes slowly began to shift. By the late Middle Ages, courtly love literature complicated the idea of purity. In poems and romances, heroines were admired not just for chastity, but wit, courage, and emotional depth. Virginity remained a big deal. But more women were being portrayed as full people, not just marriage checklists. Still, if you're a teenage bride in a Cold Stone manor tonight, your hands trembling as you undress under watchful eyes, the pressure is all too real. Whether you're ready or not doesn't matter. What matters is the sheet, the blood, the proof, and maybe, if you're lucky, a kind-hearted husband who understands how terrifying this whole ceremony really is and slips your hand into his under the covers, whispering a joke about sheep's liver to make you laugh. You're under a canopy of trees, somewhere just beyond the village, and the only light comes from the moon and the faint shimmer of dew on grass. Two figures sit close, knees brushing, whispering hurriedly in a dialect that would be alien to you now, but the tone is unmistakable, urgent, tender. A promise is being made or broken. You've wandered into the domain of secret lovers and forbidden affairs, where love is a risk and pleasure is a gamble. In medieval Europe, public morality and private passion rarely lined up. Officially, society frowned on anything resembling extramarital intimacy. But behind the haystacks, under cloaks, or tucked into castle alcoves, people weren't exactly saints. They had affairs. They passed love notes. They carved hearts into tree trunks. And, most deliciously of all, they tried not to get caught. For married women, an affair could mean ruin, loss of reputation, status, and even property. For men, the consequences were often lighter. Unless, of course, they insulted another man's honor. In that case, prepare for a duel, or at the very least, a very angry letter. Among the nobility, a cuckolded husband might demand public restitution. Among peasants, he might just throw a mug. That's why discretion mattered. A noblewoman might meet her lover while walking in the herb garden, with handmaidens carefully looking the other way. A clerk might leave suggestive lines scribbled in the margins of a prayer book. A married merchant could arrange late deliveries that just happened to require a midnight visit to the baker's wife. There are actual court records, hundreds of them documenting accusations, betrayals, and secret trysts. One of the most colorful comes from 14th century England, where a knight named Sir William confessed in writing to seducing the wife of a rival. His justification: she looked at him during Mass with eyes too long. The church was unimpressed. So was her husband. But not every affair ended in scandal. Some turned into long, quiet partnerships. Some even produced children. In cases where the husband was conveniently absent, say, off on crusade, people often turned a blind eye, especially if the family line remained intact. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were more common than we think, or simply better hidden. And for those who couldn't risk even a whisper, love tokens became their language. A ring, a bit of embroidered cloth, a lock of hair. These objects were kept close, sewn into sleeves, or hidden beneath pillows. In France, a lover might give a Périus, the frutas, a symbol of desire. In Italy, a woman might wear a pin featuring a heart pierced by a key. The symbolism wasn't subtle. And then, there were the letters. Oh, the letters. Fragile scraps of longing preserved by accident or luck. One from a 15th century scribe reads, "I press this paper where your lips should be." Another, from a nun to her former lover, confesses, "I remember the warmth of your arms more than the prayers I was supposed to say." PG 213, but deeply emotional. Let's not forget that many of these liaisons crossed class lines. A nobleman might fall for a servant girl. A lady might be swept away by a traveling troubadour. These romances were especially risky, but they happened again and again. There's the famous case of Peter Abelard and Hilose, a respected scholar, and his brilliant pupil, whose love affair caused a scandal so large it led to his castration. Yes, that happened, and her exile to a convent. Their letters still survive, brimming with pain, passion, and philosophical musings. But love didn't need Latin credentials to be dangerous. In towns and villages, a girl could be accused of seduction just for walking with a boy after dark. Men were dragged into court for carnal familiarity that may or may not have been consensual. And sometimes, the wrong lover led to real danger, banishment, beatings, even execution in extreme cases. Yet, despite the risks, people kept falling for the wrong person at the wrong time. That forbidden spark, the danger, the ache of not knowing if you'd be found out, it added a kind of drama that would make even modern soap operas blush. 1. 13th century German poem tells of a farmer's wife who met her lover by a stream every full moon. She pretended to fetch water. He pretended to fish. Their affair lasted years, unnoticed until a jealous rival spilled the secret. The ending: she was fined, he was exiled, and the stream was supposedly cursed. Moral: don't underestimate the power of nosy neighbors. And not all lovers were smooth operators. Some were awkward, fumbling, and tragically bad at hiding things. There's an English case from 1392 where a blacksmith got caught visiting a married woman after he fell asleep in her stable. He claimed he was drunk and thought it was his house. The judge was not amused. Still, affairs weren't always sordid. Many were born from genuine affection, long conversations, and quiet yearning. A widow and a local monk who met while tending graves. A traveling peddler who left behind a carved whistle shaped like a bird. These stories don't always make the history books, but they live in the margins, in poems, in court testimonies, in forgotten songs passed down through the generations. And so, you find yourself tonight, standing in a hallway, torchlight flickering. Against the stone, a door creaks open. A hand reaches out and pulls you into darkness. Maybe it's foolish, maybe it's love. But your heart races, your breath catches, and for one stolen hour, the world is reduced to warmth and whispering, and the risk of being seen, because, in the medieval world, the most thrilling romances were the ones not allowed. You're walking now through narrow, crooked streets, the smell of ale and ash drifting through the night air. Lanterns sway from iron hooks, casting long shadows on cobblestones, slick with something you decide not to investigate. Ahead, a red cloth hangs above a doorframe. It marks the threshold of a different world. You've arrived at the medieval brothel, a place where sin, survival, and strange social rituals all blend into one confusing, candlelit blur. Contrary to what you'd expect, brothels in the Middle Ages weren't always the seedy, underground dens of vice we imagine today. In many cities, they were officially sanctioned. Yes, regulated, sometimes even owned by the town council. Because when it came to controlling sin, medieval authorities had a logic all their own. If you can't stop it, you might as well supervise it and collect taxes. In London, for instance, Southwark's Bankside area was a hub for such activities, with establishments nicknamed stews, not because they served food, though some did, but because the name originally referred to the steam baths where many brothels got their start. Over time, they evolved into full-fledged businesses with operating hours, dress codes, and even rest days. Wednesdays often. A little midweek chastity never hurt. The women who worked there, some were born into poverty. Others had escaped abusive homes or been widowed too young. Many had no other options. Brothels, as grim as they might sound, offered shelter, meals, and in some cases, even camaraderie. The women slept together, worked together, and protected each other when they could. Some brothels had their own house rules, their own slang, and their own mini-economies. They weren't happy places, but they were structured, and don't think. It was all shadowy corners and whispered exchanges. In fact, prostitutes often had to wear designated clothing to make their profession known. In parts of France and Italy, women in the trade were required to don yellow veils or sashes, visible, practical, and deeply stigmatizing. Imagine walking down the street, and everyone instantly knowing your life story by the color of your scarf. That said, some clients preferred discretion. High-ranking men, nobles, judges, bishops. Yes, bishops often arranged private visits. Others flaunted their indulgences like fashion accessories. You could rent a better room, order wine, or request entertainment, which sometimes included music, dice games, or poetry recitations that were just slightly suggestive. It's here that you discover an odd contradiction. While preachers railed against sexual immorality from pulpits, cities quietly funded and protected brothels. The rationale: better here than in the streets. Better a regulated sin than chaos. Some towns even passed ordinances requiring prostitutes to get annual health inspections. Rudimentary, yes, and hilariously ineffective by modern standards, but the intention was there. One 14th century Venetian document refers to a brothel, a physician whose entire job was verifying the clean state of the ladies. We don't know how, and we probably don't want to. And yet, many of these establishments were more than transactional. Some clients returned for companionship, familiar faces, even emotional comfort. There are stories of regulars who fell in love with working women, offering gifts, letters, and even marriage proposals, though these were rarely accepted. Not because love was impossible, but because trust was a luxury neither side could always afford. One notable story comes from Lubeck, where a prostitute named Grete became something of a local celebrity. She was known for her intelligence, charm, and ability to recite long passages of scripture ironically. Wealthy men courted her. One even left her property in his will. When she eventually retired from the profession, she opened a small inn and lived out her days as a respected, if occasionally side-eyed, member of the community. Historians still argue whether brothels empowered the women inside them, or simply trapped them in a different kind of servitude. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. For some, it was a temporary refuge. For others, a lifelong burden. But almost all records agree. These women had names, preferences, senses of humor, and when, given the chance, sharp opinions about their clientele. And it wasn't just women. In several medieval cities, male prostitutes also existed, catering to both male and female clients. Their presence was often hidden in euphemism, but occasionally, town records let something slip. A tax ledger from Florence lists a companion for hire who was fined for public fondling and improper jesting, which sounds like the most medieval way to say bad flirtation. Not everyone approved. Reformers tried to shut brothels down every few decades. Sometimes they succeeded for a while. But human nature has a long memory and a short attention span. The establishments always returned, sometimes under new names like bathing houses or conversation rooms, because nothing screams subtle like charging for deniers for extended conversation with warm water. And while prostitutes lived precariously, they were also uniquely informed. They knew secrets, they overheard whispers, they could make or break reputations. Some served as informal messengers, spies, even consultants. In the court of King Charles VI of France, one lady of the night was paid handsomely to gather intel on a political rival. Her report: he snores, drinks too much, and has a birthmark shaped like a goose. Surprisingly effective. Still, the risks were constant. Disease, violence, arrest. A bad week could mean starvation. A jealous client could turn into an enemy. Some women carried knives. Others relied on their wit. Many simply hoped to survive another night. So here you are, seated on a worn bench in the back corner of a warm, crowded brothel. Laughter rises, tankards clink, and someone's playing a lute in the corner badly. A woman beside you leans in and says, not unkindly, "You look like trouble." And for a fleeting second, the line between sin and survival, shame and service, blurs in the soft glow of candlelight. Because in the medieval world, the brothel wasn't just a place, it was a mirror, reflecting everything society wanted, feared, and quietly refused to fix. You're moving now through hushed corridors, lit by flickering candlelight. The walls hung with icons, and the distant sound of chanting echoing like a heartbeat. You're inside a monastery or maybe a convent where silence is sacred, desire is denied, and yet Behind those closed doors, not everything is as celibate as it seems. In theory, monks and nuns took vows of chastity, renouncing all physical pleasures to serve God. In practice, well, let's just say the devil, allegedly, made regular house calls. Let's start with the basics. The church expected its religious personnel to embody purity. Celibacy wasn't just a recommendation, it was the gold standard. But this ideal didn't become universal until surprisingly late. For centuries, many priests married, had children, or kept concubines with varying levels of discretion. It wasn't until the 12th century that celibacy was officially and consistently enforced for clergy, and even then, enforcement had a lot of loopholes. Monks were supposed to live apart from temptation. Cloisters, stone cells, strict schedules, matins at dawn, vespers at dusk. Nuns had even stricter rules. Most weren't even allowed outside the convent gates. They devoted themselves to prayer, study, embroidery, and gardening. Sounds peaceful, right? But humans are humans. And when you place 100 of them together, deprive them of intimacy, and add long hours of quiet contemplation, sometimes the mind wanders. Sometimes the hands do too. There are records plenty of them of monks and nuns, breaking their vows in all sorts of imaginative ways. Affairs between monks and local women. Nuns meeting secret lovers during confession. One 14th century English nun was discovered sneaking out through a tunnel dug under the convent wall to meet a knight. When caught, she reportedly said, "I was practicing humility." Creative, if nothing else. One monastery, in southern Germany, became so notorious for monk-mistress arrangements that locals nicknamed it the Abbey of Winks. And yes, the abbot tried to crack down on the practice by assigning different sleeping quarters. Historians still argue whether these affairs were the exception or the secret norm. And then there's the matter of same-sex intimacy. The church fiercely condemned it, of course, but again, isolation and emotional deprivation often led to bonds that blurred into something more. Letters between nuns sometimes read like love poems. One from the 13th century reads, "Your kiss remains on my heart, like the mark of the host." Another, from a monk to his companion, laments their separation during Lent. "I dream of you in silence, as I dream of heaven." Were these relationships physical, emotional, platonic? Historians still debate it, but the longing is undeniable, and not all stories ended in secrecy. In some communities, scandals exploded into the open. A monastery in Flanders was shut down. In 1412, after a series of pregnancies among the nuns could no longer be hidden, the church responded by sending an investigator, who then promptly joined the head nun for a midnight walk that turned into, well, not an interrogation. The resulting report was conveniently lost. Meanwhile, satire flourished. Medieval writers loved poking fun at the hypocrisy of religious chastity. In one French fabliau, a priest seduces his housekeeper by convincing her that laying hands was a divine command. In another, a group of lusty monks invents a fake ritual requiring women to bathe them with holy oil. It's like Monty Python, but with incense and guilt. But real consequences existed. If discovered, monks could be defrocked, nuns exiled, and both excommunicated. Some were publicly flogged, others sent to harsher, more isolated abbeys, and occasionally, though rarely, executed. The church didn't like being embarrassed, especially when the behavior it punished outside was happening inside. And yet, many monasteries and convents also served as safe havens for women fleeing forced marriages, for men who didn't fit into the brutal world of knighthood or trade. Within those walls, people found education, art, music, philosophy. They composed hymns, illuminated manuscripts, and wrote some of the earliest European medical texts. In fact, some of the most romantic and emotionally rich writings of the time come from cloistered authors. Take Hildegard of Bingen, composer, mystic. Her writings describe divine encounters that are deeply sensual, full of light, heat, and ecstatic longing. She wasn't describing earthly love, of course, but the language often blurred the lines. Is a burning love that pierces the heart with trembling fire, spiritual or something more? So here you are, standing just outside the chapter house. Behind you, A nun kneels in candlelight, lips moving soundlessly as she prays. But in her lap lies a folded piece of parchment, ink-stained, sealed. A secret letter from someone, whose hands she's only held twice, but dreams of every night. Maybe she burns it. Maybe she hides it in the hymnal. Or maybe she replies with trembling fingers, sealing her soul between the folds. Because for all the rules carved into stone and parchment, the heart never asked for permission. You're sitting in a smoky tavern now, your hands wrapped around a wooden mug still sticky from the last drinker. A bard strums a lyre in the corner, half singing, half snoring, while two women argue over who gets to dance next on the makeshift stage. It's noisy, warm, and smells like roasted onions and stale sweat. This, dear listener, is the nightlife of the medieval common folkant. It's a far cry from the cloistered restraint of monasteries, or the velvet-draped discretion of nobles. If you wanted romance, or at least a very questionable version of it, the tavern was the place to be. By day, it sold ale and cheap stew. By night, it transformed into a social cauldron, bubbling over with music, laughter, flirtation, and the occasional chair fight. For many, this was where the first awkward glances were exchanged, where hands accidentally brushed, and where courtship began with a dance and ended in, well, let's just say morning regrets. Unlike noble banquets, which involved elaborate etiquette and multiple courses served by silent attendants, peasant revelry was all about participation. You didn't need a title to join the fun, a tolerance for cheap wine, and a high probability of stepping in someone's spilled porridge. During holidays, and festivals especially, the ones that followed harvest taverns and village greens, turned into flirtation-free forals. There were dances, riddling contests, and games designed specifically to get you holding hands or sitting on laps. One popular game involved trying to kiss someone without using your hands. It was less a game and more a village-sanctioned excuse for smoking, and of course, May Day, the ultimate festival of fertility. Villagers would head into the woods to gather flowers. Everyone knew that was code for sneaking off with your crush. In some places, communities even looked the other way if a baby appeared 9 months later. After all, it was May Day. Nature did what nature does, but tavern courtship wasn't all giggles and garlands. There were social rules unspoken, but very real. A girl who flirted too much could be branded loose. A boy who bragged too loudly might find himself challenged by someone's older brother. And if a married man got too handsy, there was always someone ready to accidentally spill ale on his lap or fist. That said, people still got creative. One lad might impress a girl by catching an eel with his bare hands. Another might recite a racy version of the Miller's Tale, and hope she laughed. Gifts were exchanged, though rarely anything fancy. An acorn carved with initials, a braid of wheat, a small round of cheese, if he was feeling generous. No roses, no chocolates, but hey, cheese is eternal. If things progressed beyond flirting, discretion became crucial. Peasant homes weren't known for privacy. Remember the one-room layout. If you wanted alone time, you either risked it outside or waited for everyone else to fall asleep. Barns, sheds, and haylofts became makeshift love nests. Not ideal, but at least the cows weren't gossipers. And yes, people talked. Gossip was the lifeblood of medieval village life. Who kissed whom? Who got caught sneaking into the miller's daughter's window? Who suddenly had a stomach flu that lasted 9 months and involved crying and diapers? Your reputation could rise or fall with a single misstep. Yet somehow, people still took the risk. Some women wielded their flirtation, like a shield charming suitors, to avoid pressure or gain favors without committing. Others genuinely searched for connection in a world where arranged marriages were the norm and romantic love a luxury. Men, too, felt the tug between expectation and emotion. You might be betrothed to one girl, but unable to stop thinking about another. Shakespeare didn't invent love triangles, he just gave them fancier language. And speaking of language, medieval slang for romance was hilarious. Swiving was the polite way to say someone had been busy. Jesting under the hedge implied something a little more hands-on, and playing at the green gown referred to rolling around in the grass, usually resulting in said gown getting grass-stained. Subtle, they were not. In some parts of Europe, Villages even held courtship nights, where boys and girls were encouraged to mix freely supervised, but still. There are records of community elders organizing group singing sessions that, unsurprisingly, devolved into flirtation festivals. One German village had a rule that no more than 3 boys could follow a girl home after dancing, because 4, apparently, was scandalous. Historians still argue whether these courtship traditions gave peasants more freedom in choosing partners than the nobility. Some evidence suggests yes, especially when parents were too busy with livestock and taxes to interfere. But others point out that girls often faced more risk than choice, especially when alcohol and social pressure were involved. Power dynamics, even in a tavern, were real. But it wasn't all lopsided. Folktales and ballads often featured strong-willed village girls who outwitted suitors, tricked false lovers, or set their own rules. In one Welsh story, a girl agrees to marry a man only if he can catch her running through the forest in the dark. He doesn't. She wins the moral. Don't underestimate someone who climbs trees for fun. So here you sit, mug empty, laughter rising around you, and someone is tugging your sleeve, asking for a dance. You rise, half smiling, feet sore from work, but heart beating a little quicker. The music isn't great, the floor is sticky, but under the flickering glow of firelight, even in the muddiest corners of life, there's room for a little clumsy romance, because in the medieval tavern, love might not last, but at least it came with music and mead. You're walking now beside a dusty cart, wheels creaking over uneven stone. The road stretches ahead through forest and field, your boots caked with mud. You're not a noble, not a monk, not even a peasant with a fixed home. You're part of a traveling group, perhaps a merchant caravan, a troupe of performers, or a band of pilgrims. And on the road, far from the laws and eyes of the townsfolk, love and sex play by a very different set of rules. Travel in the medieval world was slow, rough, and full of surprises, not all of them unpleasant. People from all walks of life crossed paths on the road. Widows seeking work, soldiers returning from campaigns, young men escaping their family farms, and women pretending to be boys to avoid trouble. The road, as dangerous as it was, also offered a strange sort of freedom. And where there's freedom, there's flirting. Temporary communities formed and dissolved with each night's camp. At roadside inns and along pilgrimage routes, people met with no backstory and no future plans. What happened in Canterbury stayed in Canterbury, mostly because there was no postal service to tell on you. Take the pilgrims described in Canterbury Tales. Among them are a knight, a prioress, a miller, a wife of Bathel, traveling together, sharing stories, food, and quite possibly more. The wife of Bath herself, widowed clothmaker, with 5 past husbands, is unashamed of her desires and jokes openly about her instruments. She wasn't just a fictional character. She was based on women who lived loudly, traveled boldly, and knew exactly what they wanted. Then there were the traveling entertainers, minstrels, jugglers, acrobats, who passed from town to town, performing in marketplaces or castle courtyards. These people were often treated as social outsiders, but enjoyed a certain romantic allure. They carried news, jokes, gossip, and songs, and sometimes they carried invitations into tents or haylofts as well. Romance on the road wasn't just poetic, it was practical. A lonely traveler might share a fire and a blanket with a stranger. 2 people headed in the same direction could become lovers for a few days or a few miles. Some even exchanged tokens or made vague promises to meet again if the wind is kind. Whether they did, historians aren't sure. But there's an undeniable romance in the idea of falling for someone you may never see again. And not all wanderers were passing through by choice. Many were forced into mobility, displaced by war, famine, plague, or politics. These displaced souls often formed impromptu families, traveling together for safety. Within these groups, relationships formed, sometimes temporary, sometimes deeply committed. Some even conducted marriage ceremonies without clergy, just vows whispered beside a stream. Of course, the road wasn't always romantic. Danger loomed constantly. Bandits, disease, and the ever-present risk of accusations. Women, especially, were vulnerable to assault or exploitation. Traveling alone was nearly impossible without drawing suspicion. That's why some disguised themselves as men, or joined caravans under false names. There's a record of a woman in 15th century Italy who dressed as a monk for 5 years while moving between cities. She was only discovered when she fell in love with another woman. Her story ends in prison, but not before a local poet turned her into a tragic heroine. It's also worth noting how legal systems treated road-bound relationships. Town authorities had little jurisdiction over what happened beyond the walls, but they certainly had opinions. Pilgrimage inns often faced moral scrutiny. Some were accused of doubling as brothels, though whether that was slander or fact is hard to tell. The church preached abstinence even on the road, but conveniently ignored what actually happened during long-distance journeys, especially when high-ranking bishops were among the travelers. And speaking of pilgrimage, those weren't always solemn affairs. Sure, people walked for penance or divine favor, but they also saw new places, met new people, and sometimes fell into temptation along the way. In one documented case from 1320s France, a group of young women were reprimanded for lewd laughter and inappropriate dancing during a pilgrimage to a shrine. They claimed they were just celebrating the joy of being forgiven. Points for creativity. One curious phenomenon was the appearance of so-called campwives. These were women, widowed or impoverished, who followed soldiers or traveling merchants, forming semi-official partnerships. They cooked, cleaned, provided comfort, and in some cases, received protection in return. Some of these relationships lasted for years, others dissolved with the next town. It wasn't marriage by church standards, but for many, it was close. Enough historians still argue whether these camp followers were empowered or exploited. Were they surviving in a world with limited choices, or shaping their own fate on the road? Probably both. The medieval world rarely offered clear answers, and not all relationships were rooted in need or danger. Some were joyful. Some were deeply human. There's a 14th century Spanish tale of a young merchant who met a girl at a roadside fountain. He gave her a fig. She gave him a song. They spent the evening by the fire, telling stories until dawn. He never learned her name. But years later, he swore he still remembered her laugh better than any prayer. So here you are, beside the fire, at a wayside inn. Someone sits across from you, eyes lit by the flames, asking where you're headed. You shrugged. North, maybe, or just away. They smile, toss you an apple, and say, "Then let's walk together." Just for a while. Because on the road, love doesn't need a destination. It just needs a moment. You're sitting now in a warm chamber scented with lavender and beeswax, where the rushes on the floor have been recently changed, and someone is humming softly just outside the door. A brass mirror reflects the glow of a single candle. You're in the domain of the married woman, now no longer bride. Not yet matron, learning how desire lived in the quiet spaces between duty and affection, faith and fatigue. Marriage in the Middle Ages was many things: a contract, a social alliance, a business merger, a religious bond. But for the people inside it, it could also be deeply personal. And when it came to sex within marriage, the expectations were surprisingly formal. The church had clear ideas about conjugal responsibility. Once married, you owed your spouse something called the marital debt, a term that sounds like it belongs on a bank notice, but actually referred to sex. Not just permission for it, but obligation. If your spouse asked nuously or otherwise, you were expected to oblige. Refusal, unless for religious reasons like fasting or pilgrimage, was frowned upon, especially for women, who were often told that pleasing their husband was a holy act, second only to childbirth. But don't assume it was all one-sided. Husbands had their own responsibilities. A man who ignored his wife's needs, or caused her harm, could be taken to ecclesiastical court. There's a documented case from 14th century England where a woman accused her husband of being too forceful and frequent. The court advised him to slow down, eat fewer onions, and possibly sleep elsewhere for a week. Still, passion wasn't exactly encouraged. The church taught that sex, even within marriage, was best kept restrained. Ideally, it was for procreation, not pleasure. Missionary position only. No indulgence in fantasies. Definitely no laughter. and certainly well, let's just say any inventiveness was considered highly suspect. But people are people. Behind closed doors, with the candles blown out and the door bolted, couples found their own rhythms. Some developed genuine affection, even love. Others negotiated boundaries, quietly perhaps a touch on the hand before bed, or a whispered joke in the dark that left both giggling under the covers. There's a sweetness in some of the letters that survive. Between married couples, especially those written when one spouse was away, a night writing home might send not just news of battles, but also tender reminders to keep warm, eat pears, and think of me when the wind howls. A merchant wife might tuck a sprig of dried herbs into her husband's saddlebag, or a ribbon, scented with rosewater. And in noble households, physical intimacy sometimes took on a ceremonial rhythm. Bedding rituals once formal, public events gradually became private. Still, it was common for guests to escort the newlyweds to bed on the wedding night, offer advice or jokes, and then close the door behind them with much winking and elbow-nudging. Some regions even had traditions where friends would sing Bodhi songs outside the couple's bedchamber. Romantic. If you like serenades with agricultural metaphors. Of course, not all marriages were blissful. Some were marked by power struggles, neglect, or even violence. While the church preached mutual respect, enforcement was another matter. A woman could appeal to the courts if her husband was cruel, but only if she had witnesses or bruises that couldn't be ignored. Conversely, a man might complain that his wife was cold, lazy, or too quick to reach for the chamber pot instead of his hand. Yet many marriages settled into a kind of partnership. They raised children. They shared stories, chores, grief, and joy. And, according to one 15th century household guide, they made merry in the cold months, when there is little else to do but kindle the fire and press close for warmth. Cozy. Contraception was a touchy subject. Officially, it was forbidden. The church taught that every act of intercourse should be open to life. But herbal knowledge passed from midwives to wives told a different story. Certain seeds, teas, and even pessaries were used quietly, though often unreliably. Rue, pennyroyal, and wild carrot were popular ingredients in folk recipes meant to cool the womb or stir no seed. Historians still argue whether these were truly effective or just hopeful folklore. But the intent is clear. Women sought agency, even within the rules. Then there was the matter of long absences. Husbands went to war, to trade, or on pilgrimage. Wives stayed home to manage estates, raise children, and sometimes rediscover independence. Letters reveal wives who grew confident in their solitude, who managed harvests and finances without hesitation. And while some remained faithful, others, well, there are enough court records to suggest a few took comfort where they could. One tale tells of a cloth merchant's wife, who received a young apprentice into her home while her husband was abroad. By the time the merchant returned, the apprentice had mysteriously transferred. The wife claimed ignorance, the neighbors smirked, and the priest quietly advised everyone to pray for clarity. Men, too, strayed. Some took mistresses, others visited brothels. In some regions, it was accepted as long as the man didn't bring shame to his wife, or spend too much of the household budget on gifts for his extracurriculars. A smart woman might overlook a few wandering eyes in exchange for political stability or well-fed children. Others took less kindly to betrayal. There are stories of poisoned wine, shaved heads, and one remarkable case involving an angry goose tied to the offending man's belt. Justice, medieval dash style, still, amid the contradictions and compromises, some couples made it work. They found quiet joy in shared routines, in the comfort of sleeping beside someone who knew their worst habits and loved them anyway. A husband who warmed her shoes by the fire before bed, a wife who left the shutters open when she knew he liked to wake to birdsong. So now you lie in a modest bedchamber, the hearth glowing low, the blankets heavy with winter wool. Your partner shifts beside you, muttering in their sleep. You smile, tuck your feet against theirs, and feel a moment of peace, because in the medieval home, love wasn't always grand, but it was often real, and sometimes even tender. You're standing in a tiled bathhouse now, warm mist curling around you, the scent of rosemary and soap clinging to your skin. Laughter echoes down a stone hallway. Feet slap gently on damp floors. You've arrived at one of the most surprising and misunderstood corners of medieval life. The public bathhouse, sequel parts, hygiene, gossip lounge, spa day, and social flirtation zone. Yes, contrary to the dirty medieval people myth, folks in many parts of medieval Europe loved a good soak, and in cities like Paris, London, Prague, or Cologne, bathhouses were as popular as bakeries. They were places where you could wash away the dust of the road, enjoy a warm meal, and, depending on the establishment, receive services beyond a back scrub. Most bathhouses had separate hours, or even separate wings for men and women. But there were also mixed bathhouses, especially in German-speaking regions. Picture this: long wooden tubs filled with steaming water, patrons lounging, with tankards of ale, linen towels draped so, and attendants bringing trays of cheese, fruit, or honeyed wine. Sound modest? It was often anything but. A popular saying in late medieval Nuremberg went, "First to the bath, then to the bed." And it wasn't always a metaphor. Bathhouses could be places of genuine affection, casual encounters, or well-negotiated flings. One 15th-century German bathhouse even offered companion bathing, where guests paid extra to share a tub with someone pleasant and pleasing to the senses. No, not exactly subtle. Officially, bathhouses weren't supposed to offer sexual services. And yet, city records across Europe contain endless fines, complaints, and strong suspicions that certain bathhouse workers were more than just skilled. With soap, some establishments were shut down temporarily, only to reopen under different names or management. One Roman bathhouse renamed itself House of Steam and Silence, which honestly sounds like either a day spa or a secret society. Not everyone went for steamy mischief. Many people just wanted to be clean. A hot bath was one of life's rare luxuries, and for the average worker, it was a welcome relief. People came with friends, spouses, even their children. It wasn't all flirtation, though the soft candlelight, naked proximity, and communal laughter didn't exactly kill the mood. Interestingly, bathhouses became known for a kind of gentle, teasing culture. Attendants would sometimes sing as they worked. Patrons swapped jokes and flirted over scented soaps. A young man might gently toss a lavender sprig into someone else's tub. If she laughed and left it floating, maybe there was hope. If she threw it back, time to towel off and go home. Of course, not all interactions were lighthearted. Boundaries could be crossed. Power could be misused. Some women were pressured into entertaining wealthier patrons, and certain bathhouses developed reputations that drew the attention of both church and state. Moralists complained that bathhouses led to laziness, lewdness, and looseness of the soul. It's always the soul, isn't it? Yet, despite the outrage, bathhouses endured for centuries. Even clergy used them. One English bishop reportedly had a private bathhouse constructed near his cathedral, which he visited every Thursday, always for health purposes, of course. In another case, a monastery in Bohemia had its own bathhouse, complete with separate tubs for abbot and guests, and a rule against singing after dark. Because apparently, nighttime harmony was the real sin. Bath culture wasn't just about pleasure, it was tied to health. Medical texts from the period recommended warm baths for everything from indigestion to melancholia. A man troubled by lust should soak in cool water and think of saints, one physician wrote. Helpfully vague about which saints and for how long. But the real heart of the bathhouse was community. It was one of the few places where different classes, genders to a degree, and professions mingled in a shared space. Nobles, craftsmen, midwives, and traveling scholars might all end up in adjacent tubs, talking politics, poetry, or who just got engaged to whom. It was like a medieval Facebook feed-only wetter. Some bathhouses even had live entertainment. In Hungary, one establishment offered lute music with your bath. In Florence, a popular bathhouse was known for staging short comic plays while patrons soaked. Think Shakespeare, but with more towels and awkward splashing. Historians still argue whether medieval bathhouses were closer to health spas or sex clubs. The answer, predictably, is both. In some towns, bathhouses remained strictly professional. In others, they evolved into spaces of flirtation and fantasy. It all depended on the town, the owner, and how closely the authorities were watching that month. What's undeniable is that bathhouses held a unique space in medieval life, public, yet private, sensual, yet ritualistic. Even in times of plague, when many were shuttered, people mourned their loss. "The city stinks more now," wrote one Londoner during a particularly grim closure. And so do the people. Eventually, bathhouse culture faded, partly due to fears of contagion, partly because the Reformation turned the social mood from "let's all soak together" to "everyone cover up and feel bad about it." But the memory of those warm, fragrant nights lingered. In songs, in jokes, in the rosewater-scented pages of forgotten diaries. So now you settle into a wooden tub, steam rising like a veil, and someone leans across the edge of your bath, with a shy grin and a platter of candied figs. The candlelight flickers. Laughter echoes softly down the corridor. Because in the medieval bathhouse, intimacy didn't need to shout, it simply steamed. You're standing now beneath a velvet canopy. The air thick with incense and secrets. The flicker of oil lamps throwing long shadows over richly embroidered cushions. A harp plays softly in the distance. This is not a tavern, nor a castle, nor a bathhouse. It's the world of courtly love. A realm of longing looks, forbidden letters, and rules so specific they could fill a chess manual. Forget everything you think you know about medieval romance. Courtly love wasn't about marriage. In fact, it almost always happened outside of it. It was an elaborate social game, played mostly by nobles, that blended admiration, worship, and desire into something halfway between poetry and performance. Art. Picture a knight, freshly back from battle, throwing himself at the feet of a noblewoman, and swearing eternal loyalty. She might already be married. He doesn't care. He offers her a handkerchief embroidered with his blood, or maybe just a poem he wrote in the saddle, slightly smeared because the ink froze. She sighs, accepts the token, and tells him he may now carry her glove into battle. Was there kissing? Maybe sex? Sometimes, but the real thrill was in the waiting, the tension, the coded messages, and stolen glances. To love, in this tradition, was to suffer, to yearn, to pine beneath her window until dawn, while composing metaphors about roses, bees, and inevitably moist dew. Historians still argue whether courtly love was ever truly consummated in most cases, or if it was just a prolonged, extravagant form of emotional foreplay. Some believe it was an excuse for actual affairs wrapped in poetic language. Others see it as a social pressure valve, a way for men and women trapped in strategic marriages to experience emotional connection without breaking the rules too obviously. What's clear is that this tradition had rules. Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century courtier, wrote an entire guidebook, The Art of Courtly Love. Among its wisdom, marriage is no excuse for not loving. Charming, also. Jealousy increases love, questionable. And the truly poetic. He who is not jealous is not in love. Freud would have had a field day. The courtly ideal placed the woman above the man, distant, unattainable, powerful. She was often older, wiser, and socially superior. Think of her as the queen in a game of chess, surrounded by pawns, observed by bishops, and capable of ending your entire emotional campaign with a single disapproving glance. Men, on the other hand, had to prove themselves, through valor in battle, wit in poetry, or embarrassing acts of public devotion. One knight purportedly wore his lover's sleeve tied around his helmet for an entire tournament. Another carved her name into his shield and, also awkwardly, into a rival knight's horse. That did not end well. And it wasn't limited to knights and ladies. Troubadours, those traveling poets of southern France and northern Spain, made a whole profession out of this aesthetic. They wandered from court to court, singing odes to women they couldn't touch. Women who barely knew their names, or women who had very much touched them last summer and then moved on. These songs weren't just about passion. They explored loyalty, despair, honor, and emotional torment. In one particularly dramatic ballad, a knight claims he would rather die on the steps of his beloved's chapel than live another day unkissed. Spoiler, he doesn't die. He goes home and writes another verse. And the women, they weren't just passive recipients of affection. Many compose songs of their own responding, mocking, or challenging their admirers. In the Troubrid's tradition, female troubadours, noblewomen wrote verses that were sharp, witty, and emotionally raw. One line from a 12th century noblewoman reads, "If I must love you from afar, then let your voice cross the mountains, not your hands." A burn wrapped in rhyme. Yet this was all done within strict social boundaries. To be too obvious was to risk scandal. To be too reserved was to lose the game. Courtly love thrived in nuance. The touch of a glove, a pause in a dance, a glance that lasted just a beat too long. Sometimes the court even got involved. In the courts of love, yes, actual gatherings of noblewomen presiding over romantic disputes questions were debated like cases. Can true love exist in marriage? Is a knight still worthy if he falters for another woman? One French duchess once ruled that a man who praises too many women loves none. She was not wrong. Of course, behind the silk and poetry, real people, with real feelings stumbled through this game. Some fell in love and were devastated when reality got in the way. Others faked it for clout. And just a few managed to turn their courtly affairs into lifelong partnerships, dodging scandal with the grace of trained diplomats. Yet for all its theatrics, courtly love offered something rare in the medieval world: emotional expression. In a society where most marriages were arranged for political or financial gain, it carved out a space however artificial where desire could be voiced, even if only in verse. So here you are, seated at a long banquet table, the smell of roast meat and mead heavy in the air. Across from you, someone lifts their goblet and nods. You smile. Neither of you speak. But you both know the real conversation is in the glance, the tension, the unspoken line of a sonnet you haven't yet written. Because, in the world of courtly love, silence can be more seductive than any vow. You're under a slate-gray sky now, pressed between carts and canvas tents in the muddy outskirts of a growing town. The streets are too narrow, the gutters too full, and the air is thick with smoke and tension. War is on the horizon already. Here, and in times of conflict, everything changes, especially the rhythms of love and sex. You're now in the world of wartime, intimacy urgent, raw, and tinged with both danger and fleeting tenderness. When soldiers marched off to war in the medieval world, they didn't always go alone. Behind many armies trailed what historians call the camp followers, a term that included cooks, medics, washerwomen, blacksmiths, and yes, romantic companions. These weren't all sex workers, though some were. Many were wives, sweethearts, or women hoping to keep close to someone they loved. Others were simply survivors, seeking food, shelter, and relative safety in the chaos of marching life. Wartime relationships had their own logic. A knight might form a bond with a washerwoman. He saw it daily. A soldier might fall for the girl who sold eggs outside the barracks. And everyone understood the stakes. Love on the battlefield could be a one-night promise, a whispered vow by firelight, or a hurried goodbye before dawn. Passion in war carried the scent of blood, iron, and rain. But these weren't just flings. Many couples formed lasting relationships on campaign. There are records of soldiers insisting their unofficial wives be given rations and quarters. And in some rare cases, even battlefield funerals. One 14th century French knight, reportedly, wore his beloved's ring into every fight, and asked that it be returned to her if he died. It wasn't. She found it herself on his hand, and buried him herself. Romantic, certainly, practical, brutally, and yes, there was sex, lots of it. But it wasn't always joyful or consensual. Wartime brought violence, including sexual violence, to the forefront. Rape was a tragic and frequent part of medieval warfare. Despite laws and church condemnation, many armies treated conquered women as part of the spoils. Chroniclers often described it with horrifying casualness. In one 12th century account, a scribe notes that the soldiers took wine, wheat, and women alike. Not every soldier partook. Some commanders enforced discipline strictly. One English general, during the 100 Years' War, threatened castration for any man caught harming civilians. Others turned a blind eye, or even encouraged looting as a morale booster. Historians still argue whether laws against rape in wartime were serious attempts at justice or just paper shields. Amid this brutality, some stories of tenderness endured. Letters from soldiers reveal a surprising emotional depth. One French archer, writing home from siege duty, sent his wife a pressed violet and a poem that began, "My hands are cracked, my bow is heavy, but still I dream of your soup." Touching, even if soup isn't the most poetic metaphor. And for women left behind, the absence created a strange vacuum. Wives of fighting men often didn't know whether they were widows or not. Months, sometimes years passed, with no word. Some waited faithfully. Others remarried. Others took lovers, either for affection or survival. One town in northern Germany was so used to husbands disappearing that it developed a tradition of waiting rings, which women would remove, only if the local priest declared the man dead. In cities, under siege, human intimacy took on a desperate edge. People clung to each other in candlelit cellars, whispered comfort beneath thunderous bombardments, or shared beds because there simply weren't enough left. Pregnancy rates often rose after battles, even in towns untouched by direct fighting. Historians theorize that in the face of death, many people sought the life-affirming solace of touch. Some places institutionalized wartime desire. During the Crusades, brothels followed the Christian armies across the Holy Land. Some were state-sanctioned, their workers receiving food and protection in exchange for service. Others were unofficial, and the women often enslaved, or destitute, had no such protections. In one particularly bleak account, a captured city's women were forced into servitude, branded, and placed under military guard. Not for safety, but to control the business. But it wasn't just men seeking comfort. Some female warriors, yes, they existed, also had lovers on the road. Joan of Arc wasn't one of them, at least as far as we know, but other women disguised as men sometimes formed romantic relationships while in armor. One tale from Italy tells of a woman who fought in 3 battles beside her male lover before they realized the other's secret. They eloped, ditched the army, and opened a tavern near Bologna. Local reviews were mixed, but they stayed open for 20 years. War also brought new intersections of culture. Soldiers encountering foreign lands sometimes fell for locals. Sometimes this led to marriages. Other times, it ended in tragedy. A famous account from the Crusades tells of a Christian knight and a Muslim woman who communicated using herbs and symbols before running off together. They were caught. She was returned to her family. He was executed. But their story survived, passed from soldier to soldier, like a legend whispered over campfires. So here you are, huddled beside a wagon, the rain cold on your neck, the fire burning low. Beside you, someone leans in closer, sharing their last piece of bread, their last dry blanket. There's no promise of tomorrow, only the shared weight of the moment. Because in war, love doesn't wait for flowers or feasts. It flares fast, burns bright, and sometimes, just sometimes, survives the silence that follows. You're inside a shadowed chamber now, where the shutters are drawn and the only light comes from the orange glow of dying coals. The world outside is quiet, muffled by fog or snow, or perhaps simply time. You're in the twilight of the medieval world where memory and legacy tangle with Mathon tonight. You're visiting the realm of aging lovers, celibate vows, and the slow fading of desire into something softer. Not everyone lived in the bloom of youth, after all. And while courtly romances and bathhouse liaisons got all the songs, medieval life offered quieter stories too, of long marriages mellowed into friendship, of widows turning away suitors with a smile and a good excuse, of monks and nuns who chose silence over seduction, and found peace in that choice. In later life, the conversation around sex changed. For women, menopause marked a dramatic social shift. It was often referred to, in church and folklore alike, as a kind of liberation. No more childbirth, no more monthly humors, no more sexual obligation. A woman past childbearing age was seen by some as safer, wiser, less tempting, perhaps, but also more respected. One 14th century text referred to elder women as keepers of fire and stories. Sounds poetic, until you realize they were also often blamed for stirring up village gossip or harboring forbidden knowledge. Men, too, faced changes. While aging knights were still romanticized in stories, the body had its limits. Herbal manuals quietly recommended mixtures of goat's milk and saffron for sustaining a husband's vigor. Other remedies included garlic, mashed with wine and deer antler powder. Historians still argue whether these worked or just made people smell intimidating enough to distract from their diminishing virility. And yet, older couples endured. There are records of spouses still sleeping in the same bed well into their 50s and 60s, which, medievally speaking, was a solid lifespan. Love letters shift in tone, fewer fiery declarations, more tenderness. A husband writing from town might say, "I have seen no cloth as fine as yours," referring to her spinning. A wife might reply, "Come home soon. Your boots need patching. Also, the cat misses you." It wasn't all warmth, of course. Some aged into bitterness, especially if their youth had been squandered or stolen. A widowed brewer in York once posted a public notice saying she was not seeking a husband, nor any man, unless he brought 4 barrels of ale and a quiet mouth. Legendary. And some chose celibacy willingly. Monasteries and convents weren't just escape routes for failed nobles. They were full of people who chose solitude, or at least simplicity. The vow of chastity wasn't always about repression. It could also be about quiet, about clarity, about devotion to something unchanging. Nuns in particular often formed close emotional bonds with each other. Letters between cloistered women brim with affection, and occasionally, yes, a touch of longing. While the church insisted these friendships be purely spiritual, historians note that the language used in some correspondences would raise eyebrows even today. One abbess wrote to her former student, "Your voice still echoes in my prayers, and your absence is the thorn beside my pillow." PG 213, maybe, but still suggestive. These spiritual bonds weren't limited to convents. Older people often formed platonic partnerships, roommates, in old age who shared food, blankets, stories, and yes, sometimes a bed, though not always for the reasons people assumed. With no pensions, no elder care, and no Netflix companionship. With survival, and then there were the widows. Oh, the widows. Feared by some, admired by others, they walked a strange line between independence and scrutiny, free from their husband's control, and technically outside the church's marital expectations. They often ran businesses, owned land, or funded their son's education. Some remarried, others never did. In one Spanish will, a widow left her second-best cow to the man who never touched me, though he asked often. Petty or poetic, you decide. Historians still debate whether widowhood truly offered freedom, or simply another kind of confinement. Some argue it was a woman's chance to reclaim her voice. Others point out how often widows were accused of witchcraft, especially if they lived alone or possessed strange herbs. A lonely old woman with a good memory was as dangerous to medieval society as a young one with a pretty face. Still, there were sweet moments. One elderly couple in 13th century Italy insisted on being buried in the same grave, his hand upon hers, that their touch might stir the spring soil. Ah, one man, blind in old age, asked his granddaughter to describe his wife's smile to him each evening. "She still wears it, even when she's angry," the girl reportedly said. And so you find yourself in the soft hush of age, lying beside someone who knows all your faults, and still reminds you to pull the blanket up when you shiver. There's no passion, now not the wild, breathless kind, but there's warmth, there's memory, there's the sound of breath sinking in the dark dot, because in the end, medieval love didn't die with youth. It simply slowed, softened, and settled in like winter snow, quiet, deep, and somehow still alive. The fire's just embers now. The night presses in, thick and soft like wool, and your limbs have gone heavy with stillness. The sounds of the medieval world, shouting merchants, clattering hooves, flirtatious laughter behind tavern walls fade into the background, replaced by something slower. The gentle hush of memory. The sigh of time letting go. You've wandered far tonight, from castle chambers to dusty roads, from candlelit baths to war-torn fields. You've brushed shoulders with barmaids and barons, abbesses and apprentices, poets and pilgrims, all trying to make sense of that strange, sweet, clumsy thing we call love. Not the kind in storybooks, not the kind carved in stone, but the real kind, awkward, human, fleeting. And maybe now you see it, how the past is less foreign than you thought. How the people who lived before you longed for the same touches, the same reassurances, the same quiet presence in the dark. They just used different words, wore different shoes, lit different lamps. So close your eyes now. Let the cold flagstones give way to feather beds. Let the flickering torchlight become moonlight spilling through old glass. Somewhere, far away, someone still waits beside a fire, still hums an old tune, still keeps a piece of cloth that smells faintly of lavender and something like longing. You don't need to chase that story anymore. You're part of it now, and morning can wait.